Season 6 of Warzone 2 and Modern Warfare 2 is here, and it looks like it's going to be the final season before Modern Warfare 3 comes out. So let's go out with a bang and make sure we've got on the best settings possible for the rest of this season and going into the new game. So we're here to talk about graphics, and we'll start with on-demand texture streaming. To get the best visuals possible, of course you want this switched on, since this streams those high-definition textures straight to your console. However, if you do experience any visual bugs, or maybe your frame rate drops and it becomes a bit choppy, I do recommend switching this off, and that's more likely on the older generation consoles. As always, I recommend switching off world motion blur, weapon motion blur, film grain, and depth of field. All of these settings can make the game look more immersive, so when we play campaign we might want that, but when we're playing multiplayer and Warzone, we just want to get an advantage over our enemies, or at least just see them as clearly as possible. And by switching all of these off, we're going to get exactly that. For Fidelity FX CAS, this is going to be dependent on which console you play on. I recommend for newer generation console players, so the Xbox Series X and S and the PS5, switch this setting on and turn the strength right up to between 30 and 100. I've got mine switched on 100 because it takes out that blurriness that can occur on the game to give me an amazingly sharp image. But I know on some consoles and some setups, this can make the game look a little bit grainy. If this does happen, of course just switch the strength down, and on older generation consoles, you might want to run something very low between 10 and 20, or even switch this setting off altogether. The idea of this setting is that you get a sharpening effect, but without reducing your performance. So in theory, it shouldn't affect your frames per second. However, after testing, it does appear that it affects your frames per second by about 1 to 3, which I know isn't much, but some people hold that very dear, so that choice is very much up to you. But like I say, I run mine on 100, and I play on the Xbox Series X. For 120Hz refresh rate, we want this enabled, as this essentially allows us to get 120 frames per second. So this is only going to be available to newer generation console players, and only to those that have a monitor or TV that can actually run 120Hz. For field of view, this is going to be personal preference to a certain extent. I've got mine cranked all the way up to 120, but I wouldn't recommend that to everyone necessarily, and that's because the higher your field of view goes, the lower your frame rate goes. So again, it's only a few frames that we are going to be losing by going all the way up to 120, but for some people that's really important, and on older generation consoles, that frame rate loss is going to be even more. In addition, some people think by going all the way up to 120, you actually lose a little bit of aim assist. So for most people, I would recommend about 108. And I know that sounds really random, but you seem to get the best of both worlds on 108. Either way, I would recommend not going below 100, as this will just stop you seeing things around you. For ADS field of view, I've got mine on affected, and I recommend you do the same, as that just means that when we aim in, we're still at the same field of view value that we've just set here, as opposed to your whole screen zooming in to 80 FOV. Then for weapon field of view, I recommend putting this on wide. As it says on the right here, the weapon looks smaller, and we kind of want that so we can just see more of the environment on the screen. Then for camera movements, we want to put this down on least, which is 50%. Again, like before, it can make the game look a little bit more cinematic, but it can put you off, mean that you're gonna miss things, and can even give you motion sickness. Then as we come down to brightness, I recommend actually going quite high with this. I've gone all the way up to 75, and this is purely because the visibility across all maps is actually quite variable, so you want to ensure that the darkest point on the maps you're playing is lit up. For safe area, I always recommend minimizing this as much as possible. This just reduces the distance that your eyes have to travel when you're looking at the minimap, so you're just less likely to miss things. Then we can have some even bigger impacts on our visuals by heading over to interface, and specifically color customization. Here we can add that saturation kind of effect that PC players have, and that's simply by putting on filter 2 and turning the intensity all the way up to 100. This makes the game look a lot more vibrant, and those colors really pop. Not only does this make the game just look better generally, but means that colors don't get mixed up as easily. So quite often, enemies just pop out and stand out a lot more compared to the background environment. So they're all the important settings. Obviously for a lot of these they're subjective, so I'll leave that up to you. And now I recommend checking out the best controller settings this season if you really want to get ahead of the competition.